This is Season 1, Episode 12 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and of course some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Designing Compelling Monsters, or I don't remember that from the Monster Manual. Welcome to Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast, just like I said, where you have advice, ideas, cool stuff found, and a lot of strong opinions. I'm Carl with my co-hosts James and Eric, and you'll find information about the show at masteringtherpg.com. If you have questions, want Eric to adjudicate a problem, or just want to give us some feedback, go ahead and send us an email at gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com. All of that is one word, and so we're happy to be here again. Hey, gentlemen, nice to see you. Nice to hear you. How you doing, Eric? How you doing, James?
I'm doing good. How are you guys doing?
Hello, gentlemen. It's going very well indeed. Well, indeed. Keen to get into this week. I love this topic.
Yeah, you're rubbing your hands like an evil mastermind, like your minions, your hundreds of minions before you do as you command. So, yeah.
Exactly right. Let's create some masterminds and some minions. Just serve
some
them.
Abominations.
This is going to be good.
That's awesome. Awesome to hear. So anything exciting going on with you? I got a new campaign coming up that I'm just getting ready to start with Eric and trying to figure out the first couple of adventures and how it's all going to tie together. It's sci-fi. Pretty excited about that. How about anyone else doing anything exciting?
I'm on the opposite side of that spectrum. I'm winding up my yearly campaigns. I run campaigns for children's group after school at the moment, and so we are into session 35 of 40 this week. So winding up campaigns to their conclusions, which is always fun and always a bit fraught to make sure you give enough space and enough time. We should do something about ending campaigns soon because it's a big thing, and so I'm doing frenetic writing where you're trying to jam everything in as much as you can, tie up all those loose ends with 5 sessions to go. So that's taking all of my time.
Yeah, I'm gearing up to be in a new game with a new character and getting their voice, making connections with other players. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. It's a sci-fi game. Yeah.
It sounds like the match made in heaven.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, awesome. So this week we wanted to talk about designing compelling monsters.
Mastering the RPG with Carl, Eric, and James. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, welcome. I put some notes together for this one, bizarrely, which is not my usual modus operandi because I'm that passionate about it. So talking this week about creating your own monsters, and particularly compelling monsters that might make a real difference. And so I thought we'd talk a little bit this week about why we would do this. Why on earth would you need to create monsters? There are literally hundreds and thousands of monsters and various monster manuals and guides for almost every system. I can't think of a system that doesn't have a monster manual of some sort that comes alongside with it. How do we do it? How would we put monsters together? What's some first principles about creating some compelling beasties? Some quick ways to shake up existing monsters, which we'll talk a little bit about how do you reskin existing things, recolor things, so that you don't have to do all the work of creating something from scratch. I thought we'd talk a little bit this week about boss battles, how to create a good boss fight, because they're often the big compelling monster. And I don't know about you guys, whenever I'm creating a campaign, I actually spend a lot of time looking at the end boss or the mini bosses that go along the way to make sure that those encounters are really special. And then finally, a little bit of player advice. How do you make these monsters, and how does your player character reactions fuel and benefit a new monster or a new campaign? So I thought we would set up there, and I guess the opening thing is, why on earth would you do this? At the moment, with role-playing games going for as long as they have, there are inordinate amounts of monsters, of monster stat blocks, of every single different myth and legend that has been statted and created. All you have to do is Google that's a bugbear stat block, and you will get litany of so many different things. So why on earth would we need to create our own? Why would we do this, gentlemen? What are some reasons that you've found as to creating your own monsters?
Well, for me, the obvious answer is to create unique flavor for your campaign, for your world, the thing that you're building. It adds a uniqueness. It's all your own. It's not something that someone else developed. It's not just something you pulled from a core book. And honestly, it's really an exciting part of world building. It's what makes, just like doing continents and figuring out cities, figuring out the creatures and how they live and why they exist is part of the fun of world building. And that's why I think it's something you need. You need to do it because it makes it interesting for players, because it's that unique flavor and to your campaign and your world. There's obvious other reasons. Eric, you probably have a few yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. At the top of the list for me is that it's fun for me. It's creative. You can really put a lot into it, and it's really satisfying to see players react to a unique monster or something they didn't expect. Right? We're all about defying expectations, subverting expectations. I think is a big thing too, and that's what makes story compelling. Is when you do that, and one of the ways you can do that in a story, in a narrative campaign, is to subvert expectations as far as monsters go. About introducing a new family of monsters can really shake things up. And like you said, James, like I think the other big reason is people know what to expect. I mean, like you said, the bugbear. I think the best example of this is the troll. Right?
Yes.
Trolls are one of the most well-known creatures, and we all know about their regeneration. We know how to overcome the regeneration. I mean, most people do that are nerds of most sorts. So, it's not so much of like when trolls were first written about, maybe they were exciting, but now people kind of know, and it maybe leads to metagaming. It maybe leads to not being as exciting or as like desperate, because you're like, how do we kill this thing? So I think that's another big thing too, is just keeping that challenge for players and keeping the mystery, right? Because their characters, they might not know what a troll is, but the players do. So it is often also hard as a player to kind of balance that. I find it too, like it's hard to often, you don't want to metagame, but it's hard not to because those things. So it also helps the players out for sure.
It's an interesting dilemma, isn't it? These games are loved because of often the tropes that they're brought into.
Yeah.
That people love the idea of the many eye-stalked beholder or the mimic or the dragon that comes down with dragon's breath. But yet it makes it tricky to role-play some of that stuff if their character hasn't experienced that before, and trying to overcome player knowledge with these things and trying to shake things up while still including some of these classic creatures in games. It's often a little bit tricky. One thing I've noticed, unfortunately, I'm seeing this even with younger players at the moment, is this idea of they may have the monster source book with them while they're playing, and I'm finding that particularly problematic with a couple of young 12-year-olds at the moment that are going, that's not in the monster manual whenever I play.
Wow.
Whenever I'm playing it at the moment.
They tell you that's not in the monster manual. Wow,
that's not in the monster manual.
Okay.
And even worse, I'm finding that when I am presenting a classic monster, they're literally ticking off the hit points, going, he's got more hit points than the book. And so I'm finding the need to create and redesign and reskin creatures a lot at the moment, just to exert my dominance as the game master on those.
Yeah, this is not a Pokédeck. The monster manual is not a Pokédeck for you to know every monster,
right.
Catch them all.
I think the monster manual looking has always been a thing as far as tabletop games been around, but I think the new thing here is that they tell you that it's not in that's not what's in the monster manual. That's totally new to me. I've never seen that before, so that's a unique thing, I think.
I think they perhaps lack some of the social nuances, some of the other more sly players that you might get into.
Yeah.
But I present monsters as best I can, and I presented a Bulgara yesterday and was being particularly spooky about this monkey-like demon with a gaping maw and lots of ichor that's spewing out as it roars to you. And one of the players went, that's all right, he's only got 84 hit points, we can take him. I'm like, but what? So creating and reskinning my own monsters is becoming almost a part-time job at the moment to try and keep my players on their toes. Moving on to just touching base on Carl's point too. I really love doing this stuff. I really love creating creatures and creating creatures from myths and creating creatures from imagination and creating creatures from sources that might not be readily available. I live in Australia. We have quite different legends in terms of our Indigenous storytelling and quite different. Even Irish and English legends from settlers that came over here in the 18th century, and so I love tapping into some of my country's kind of lore in order to create some unique creatures for down here that is very much well received by Australian players. When I drop one of them on the table as well, they can recognise what it is that I've done. So I do agree it's a really big part of world building. Any other reasons, guys? What else would fuel anything for creating monsters? Or do you think we've covered that off pretty well?
I think the
other
bottom
kind of thing is, yeah. Sorry. Go on.
I mean, the bottom line is it's the same old, right? Just get tired of the same old anyway. And whether you know the monster manual or you don't, there's a reason why there's an industry of people creating monsters constantly and publishing books constantly, because they want something different and something interesting that they don't know before. So go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, my only thing is the kind of last thing, which maybe isn't the biggest reason, but similar to what you were saying, Carl, about like fitting the setting and the world you're building. But sometimes you need a monster that kind of ticks off a certain type of challenge. Like if you have a certain kind of set piece you're doing or a certain type of specific challenge tied to maybe like an element or a theme, and you don't really have monsters that work with that, that could be another reason, is that you can really, focus in on the abilities maybe to kind of accentuate whatever kind of challenge you're doing. Like if you're having people jump across chasms, right? Maybe have something that like lives below and kind of tries to snatch them. So you might have to create something interesting there. So it can be a really good way to like add spice to the actual mechanics and just like specific types of challenges that are different than just a normal fight.
Fantastic. One thing I also is pure and unadulterated fun when I create my own monsters, and I must admit I've got a good example of when we played some Savage Worlds with Eric.
Yeah.
Eric brought in some were-rat-like creatures, but were-rats who were entirely taken from the cast of Grease in terms of the T-Bird group of were-rats. And a lot of their abilities and things were relating to that musical, which was very madcap and extremely silly. I'm assuming that's not from an official rule book. That's something you actually created.
Completely. Yeah. And it's same with the rat emperor who I came up with, was just this kind of this conglomerate, ooze-like almost 1,000 rats together with tentacles and had 4 mouths and kind of control all of them too. So that was just, we'll talk about that more once we get into the mechanics and how that stuff works. But yeah, it was just
ultimately
just kind of working through it and just thought, oh, that would be a cool thing because this is a modern game. Let's have them be obsessed with the musical Grease.
Yeah, why not indeed? So there's many reasons why. I think we've touched on them. The main one seems to be because it's damn cool and interesting and it's fun. So I guess we need to delve in, and this will probably take a little while, but delving into the mechanics of how do you do this? And I'm conscious that we often talk of different systems, and so there'll be different mechanical systems about how you might create a monster, depending whether you're running a Pathfinder or a Savage Worlds or a Call of Cthulhu or a Dungeons and Dragons. My background in this is very much in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, so I've had more experience in creating monsters for that system. But in terms of starting points, where do you start from? If you're trying to create a new, unique, compelling monster that isn't in the monster manual, something entirely different, what's your starting point, Carl? Where would you begin this mammoth task of creating a mammoth?
Well, since I like to bring it as part of world building and something unique to my campaign, it starts off, number one, we put the stat blocks to the side. We don't care about those for now. Is why does it exist? What's its purpose in the first place? What's its job, quote unquote, in the world? Why is it there? Because everything has a reason for existing. I remember when I first started playing D&D, I would put different creatures, random monsters in different rooms that are right next to each other, and I wouldn't care that they have nothing to do with each other. Now it's like it's very important that it has a purpose. There's a reason why it exists, and that reason then easily leads into then now you start talking about what words describe it. If looking at it, what are the words that describe it? And that's going to be leading, and the purpose leads into that. Those physical characteristics come directly from its purpose. And then form leads to function. Function leads to how it interacts with the environment. And so purpose and its interaction with the environment, and then ultimately the adventures and the people who come up against it, that all starts working together as kind of a whole. So it starts off, why does it exist? And that's the number one thing. And so I'll let others kind of walk through their kind of their channel of thought as well. What do you think, Eric?
Did similar example, similar starting point?
It really depends. I mean, there's two different. I think when I would need a monster, it's either if I'm doing like a homebrew campaign, I might just make a bunch of monsters up front and do like family of monsters. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But like, I know that I need monsters, so I work on them then. Or if I'm like you're designing an encounter, you know that you need some type of unique monster. So those are the two kind of things you need them for. But as far as inspiration, I mean, you can get inspiration from even just looking at a picture and then kind of saying, oh, I really love this picture. What are its abilities? What are its things about? You start kind of there. Starting from, like you said, going from mythology. Those are really good places to go from. And a lot of the D&D mythology isn't the actual mythology. So even if you go look at like, oh, what is a troll? Or what is some of these other things, they might be different and you could still get something different. And also like folklore, right? Not just mythology, kind of like, just normal folklore just around your town or whatever. Yeah, I mean, those are the main reasons. I think sometimes if you think of a theme, like in that rat example, I know I needed a gang. That was a big thing, a gang that you guys could like talk to at some point, and it kind of just snowballed from there. And then thinking, okay, well, I know this is a funny game. Like, how can I have a little twist on it? And that, then just thinking about like, well, what could they be obsessed with? And that kind of just got the ball rolling into that way. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can draw from. Also just movies, right? Like watching a certain movie. Oh, that was a cool thing in that movie. I'm going to take that out and do what I want with it. So I think you can draw a lot from the media that's already out there if you need inspiration, or just take inspiration from whatever, also what's written. I think we'll talk about that later too.
And I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of inspiration in media, but the only concern I have is a lot of that media inspiration still lives with the tropes, and so you're bringing things that people will recognize as they see it. But
yeah, I guess I mean more of a starting point.
Yeah, it's a place to start.
More of a starting point if you need some type of idea. Yeah.
I think I come to it from a mix of places similar to you guys. I do start with the ecology and setting and try and figure out where are my players at, what's likely to live there, what niche does this creature fill in the environment that it lives in. But equally important, I look at what is the encounter that I need to provide, or what is the niche that these creatures will inhabit within my story. For example, we were doing a Feywild game, and we've talked about a Feywild game a lot. I was looking for a group of creatures that were going to be allies, but not powerful allies. So allies that are worth protecting and worth saving. Allies that might flex a little bit, but aren't exactly, they're not going to save the PCs. They'll fight alongside, but not be great. And so created a race of hedgehog folk that, as monsters that just kind of would fill this niche in the ecology of the game in some ways. In a similar vein, creating shadow creatures that will inhabit a shadow realm. So looking at the not just the ecology of the world I'm creating, but the ecology of the game that I'm creating, the narrative of, and what does that narrative need so that I can create monsters that fill that gap, NPC races and monsters that can fill those niches within the game. That's a lot of the starting point for me. And then, of course, trying to make them as fun and interesting and unique as possible so that they are marked different. They're significantly different to what you would find in a book.
Well, I think they go hand in hand. I mean, those are obviously two sides of the same coin. And I definitely see where you're coming from, and that plays into my thinking. I guess I didn't express it in that way for sure. Like, for example, in my post-apocalyptic world where people are growing, civilization is growing back again, I had a bunch of goo monsters, which were basically creatures that were made up of stuff left over from gray goo, that the nano machines would create gray goo and that would end up creating monsters. But that was all about, there's something that has a purpose in there. But just like you said, there's an ecology of the kinds of encounters that then they would have, right? How do they interact with this environment? So why do they exist? How do they act in the environment? And then I think I did have to tailor them because ultimately it's not just an exercise in thought process, right? Ultimately players have to go against them. And so they need to have, they can't be a goo bunny rabbit just because, that would be the most likely thing in a scenario is a goo. Well, no, it has to have big pointy teeth, right? There has to be a reason for it to interact with the players. So good point. You make a great point there. And I'm sucking in all these points because with this science fiction game, with going to different planets, creating
just
monsters.
Just beginning it now.
Yeah, creating monsters and creating creatures are going to be, bread and butter, right? It's going to be a big part of it. So,
and like making a unique planet for a unique planet, you want to have like different types of
So I do this podcast so I can learn. Basically, I think that's what I do. It's like I learn stuff. So.
This is a great echo, not an echo chamber. What do you call it? A sounding board where we can bounce all ideas off each other. Think tank.
Yeah.
There we go. Exactly right. So once we've come to these first principles and we've thought about our first concepts and where these creatures might fit in the world, and we've been inspired by where it is, the big challenge I find when you're creating monsters in particular is encounter balance. Trying to these free throwing ideas where. Okay, I need hedgehogs, so they're going to roll into a defensive ball at some point and then pull out spines, and hurl them at creatures, and they might have extra armor, and I want them to be ferocious little guys with spears, and I need them to explode in a puff of quills at once per 5 rounds or something like that. The playtesting and the balancing of these things is often the big challenge. Any tips or pointers? And sorry, guys, I didn't put this on our notes. It just dawned on me that this is probably a big part of what we're talking about today.
With Savage Worlds, it's not as Savage Worlds is a much more open to make creatures. With CR, it's a little bit more difficult. But the best way for as far as balance goes is. We're going to talk about later about reskinning monsters, but in this case, you can reskin abilities. So if there's already an ability of a similar level that you're looking for, that's maybe like a fire explosion, there's nothing saying that you can't take whatever that is, reskin it as a spine explosion in your example, and you know that it's mechanically, numbers-wise, it's roughly balanced for whatever CR that you need it, but you've now reskinned it. And so it's going to feel different to the players. Maybe it's a different damage type, piercing versus fire, whatever. But as far as like the numbers go and what the expected character levels are, you already have that down. So I think to me that's the number one thing is just to look at like what have the game designers done, and get an idea from them because they're the ones that are paid and have put all the money into actually figuring out balance. And that's where I think for CR Savage Worlds, Carl, you probably have a lot more to say on that. It's a much more open one. So if we can talk about the more narrative games, that's a different.
Yeah, I play a lot. I play basically Savage Worlds, and the one thing that comes in with Savage Worlds that I preach is balance doesn't matter. You're never going to have balance. So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about balance. But I
there's some though. There is some.
Well, you obviously have to think about it a little bit, but so I'm being a bit tongue in cheek, but the reality is there's no CR and trying to get things where, X number of players of a certain level can go against a CR level creature of this type. And so you have to go through and I looked at the monster manual or the Dungeons Master Guide, the creature creation, and it's like that's like a word puzzle, math puzzle to try to get everything put together, and that's just I'm much more, and it kind of comes back to a little bit of what you were saying, Eric. Reskinning. I'm much more just say the creature needs to do a thing, and that thing needs to do about this much damage. So okay, done, and then call it what it is and move on with my life. And because, you're not going to get it perfect ever because you can't play test it. James, you might be able to because you run these games very often. So you might be able to, tweak things as you go along. But generally that one use in the campaign, unless you're going to use it over and over again, it's tough to even get the chance to play test it.
I do tend to play test things, and I guess to move on from that, I will do dummy encounters. What I look at is a 5-round combat simulation, I guess, where I'll look at thankfully I've got a VTT that I can do this pretty easily with. I can, just double click a couple of buttons and it will show me how much damage and armor class type and bits and pieces. So I'll often play 5 rounds of my big bads against a dummy group and see how much damage it can outlay and see if that's going to be problematic. But yeah, I guess I agree that the reskinning is probably the key for me in trying to get the mechanics of this right. There's a great dungeon master and YouTuber and podcaster, a guy called Sly Flourish. I've talked a lot about his Lazy Dungeon Master guides before. He does a lot of reskinning in terms of getting his damage right and his monsters right, and often he'll just change the damage type from a creature. So you want a centaur, and we want an undead centaur. Well, the centaur's now doing necrotic instead of piercing damage, and so he'll literally take a whole creature and then do a very quick reskin to get that going. And that way you already know, as Eric said, you already know that the balance is kind of there because the playtesting's already been done around it.
Well, I would say
certain.
My advice was more for like just looking at a specific ability that's similar. I think that is maybe it's a good time to talk about like, for me, there's like 3 levels of monster creation. There is the simplest one, which I think we brought up now a little bit, is, you have a troll, you change its picture, and then you tweak maybe a tiny bit of things. So like in the troll example, it could have a metallic body and it's resistant to, and it's like a lumbering, doesn't look like a troll, right? It's more of a like an ape, like a metallic ape, and it has a vulnerability to electricity, say, right? Just those 2 things, and you've changed the picture, that'll make people not know what it is. And then the second way, I think, is you can take 2 monsters and then mash them together, which I've done before, where you just kind of take half of those abilities, and then you have the full making, which you can still reskin stuff, right? Like I said, if you need that pine explosion, explosion of quills, then you can just look at like what a fireball would be or something for a similar CR creature. But I think often if you need just a monster for a quick encounter, then first look at just reskinning, because that's, if you're kind of stressed about it and you really need a monster to put in, but you're worried that they already know what it is, just put a new picture on it, change a couple of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the basic ways of reskinning and doing this. And a lot of this is the easy stuff out of the box.
Yeah.
And perhaps this leads us on very well, is this quick ways of how do we take existing monsters, how do we move them around, how do we make them a little bit different? And I guess for me, I was thinking more of my problem that I'm dealing with at the moment, where I have younger players, but even older players, that understand the monster manual really, really easily. They've played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons now. They know the tropes. And how do you kind of mix this up a little bit? One of the techniques I've found, and I got this a lot from, is a series of books for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition from a publisher named Dragonics. And they do a number of, they call them the Monster Manuals Expanded. And I guess this is a third-party publisher that has codified what I've been doing for quite a while. And that is, what I try and do is create subclasses of monster as well, just to try and shake things up a little bit. I'm running the campaign Storm King's Thunder at the moment, which is a lot of giant encounters, and you end up fighting the same giant over and over and over and over and over again. And so one of the things that I've looked at doing very, very much is creating subclasses of giants. And so you have a fire giant, but you have the fire giant thug, or the fire giant slag thrower, or the fire giant artificer, or the fire giant dreadnought, or the fire giant, fire belcher. Or you just kind of keep making up these little subclasses where you'll take the base class, the base stat block of a monster, and then just add an extra ability or 2 on the top of them. So it doesn't radically overbalance it, but will also keep your players surprised at, well, hang on a minute, that's not what fire giants normally do. They don't certainly breathe fire on me. That's new. And kind of adding abilities, adding things, adding these subclasses to existing monsters also allows me to shake it up as well. Any other kind of easy reskin thoughts, Carl? Do you do this much?
Well, I do it a lot. I'm a big fan of steal and reskin, and then make tweaks and borrow from other things. And, add my own abilities. One of the things that I think ties into what Eric was saying earlier when he talked about, troll might have a different body or whatever, you actually can just completely turn around and the way things work. And so, yeah, it looks like a troll. It is a troll. Everything's a troll. But guess what? It's not affected by fire. And that it just completely changes how the players interact with it. And they say, this world is different. Even though you're using the tried, the old school tropes, they're running into these things. Maybe a mimic doesn't work the way a mimic always does in normal D&D. It works differently. So
yes,
that's a great way of just like, but you got to stay on top of that. If your world is like that, then make your world like that. Make it so that the tropes aren't the same everywhere you go. So that's an easy one. It is the same, but there's a couple of things that are just completely different and you don't expect them at all.
Yeah, that's when I was talking before about defying expectations, subverting expectations. That's definitely one of the ways, like to just really mix it up for people. And I think even with creating your own monsters, like there's also just tropes about like, what a monster looks like and what it does. So you see a big monster, you might think, oh, it's just a strong brute, but maybe it, is psionic and is actually quite weak physically. It's just large. Maybe it's just full of liquid or something, but it's psionic, right? And that's a really good way to like. The players are thinking it's going to be this kind of encounter, and then it kind of switches on them, and that really like makes them, oh crap, like we gotta really pay attention here. Yeah, and I don't know if we're going to talk. I also want to talk about like you brought up, James, is the kind of subclasses. I love doing this, and I love doing this with even original monsters too. Well, I'll often create, in the front, I'll create like a family of monsters, and I think that's a really good way to, when you're creating monsters, to kind of get the most juice out of the lemons, that kind of get the most out of it you can with your original idea. And very basically, I see it as you have your base monster, you have your mook monster. This is your kind of run-of-the-mill version, right? Your normal goblin. And then you have an elite version, and you have like a special version. And then a boss can be from one of those. But basically, just having those three is enough diversity to make monsters. Now you can add more and more, of course, but I think just having those three, and like you said, you have your basic one that has its theme. Your elite one is just going to generally be like a stronger version of your base one, maybe with some better weapons, maybe a couple of other abilities. Your special one could be anything from like the magic wielder of that thing, or could have like a really unique effect. Like remember I was talking to you about making kind of these dogs for the Empire in our Feywilds game. I had this idea for these my character just blurted out that there was alchemical dog war machines, made from like alchemy, and I was like thinking about how could we do that, and my main thought was like, well, there's this one dog that it has poison breath and it has a giant cannon on its back, and there were some mechanics like where it can't move and shoot in the same turn, and it's resistant to poison. And then there was like an elite version of that I was thinking that was a higher CR, that had even like a bigger blast and different abilities. And then there was a special version that was also a dog and had poison stuff, but could teleport and, do some other stuff. It was more psionic. So it was kind of a twist on that. So I think just those three things really makes it seem like there's kind of a robust, family here. This is something that I did with my Fallout game where I made like, I was writing Fallout into Savage Worlds, but I had my ghoul, I had my like lurker ghoul, I had my glowing one ghoul, right? Same thing with like I had just all the type of monsters. I had like they do in the video game, the different versions, just to make it feel like, wow, this isn't just a one thing. There is like a genus here. There is a species here, and they have different niches, but they're still kind of the same vibe. So sorry,
this is the Alien movie series at large. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the revealing of those different abilities means that you certainly get more mileage out of your monsters.
Yeah,
run the first few encounters with your base monster build, and then suddenly you have something a little bit different that joins the fray, and so effectively you're subverting the expectation that you've actually set the group as well. You've said, here it is, but oh no, now there's something a little bit different. Oh, and now there's something entirely complicated. And what I love doing is what happens when all three of those things are fighting together, and you're allowing a different tactical element about how those three builds would operate together. Who would go in first and who would hang back, and how would for example, I love creating shaman-like characters that might do a bless or a bane, or they're effectively buffing the base troops, so that suddenly that becomes a whole different complication, something that's very, very different in terms of the encounter.
And it's interesting if these creatures don't have a significant difference between them in look and style, so Dragonlance did a lot of this, right? You had the Draconians and they mostly looked the same. And the characters in the book were surprised when this one happened to blow up on them after they killed it versus this other one did something else. So I feel that that's a great surprise to the players. And I think you might have been alluding to that when you were talking about these subclasses, right? That it looks like a fire giant. Sure, it must be a fire giant, but this one breathes fire. That's not... But this other one didn't breathe fire, and it looked exactly the same, or mostly the same. So I got to think about that tactically as a player, because any one of these things could be a shaman, and you don't know. I mean, unless, I think the fantasy tropes is the wizards are running around in robes and the fighters are running around in armor, but that doesn't have to be true for your monsters, right? By any
exactly right. Yep.
I think that goes completely back to subverting expectations, and like you said, James, even to your own expectations that you set up. And that's what I think we're really going for, is we want to keep players on their toes. And we want them to be engaged so much that in character, they're asking those kind of questions. Do I think this person's a magic user? Oh, have I heard of this monster before? Like, let's do those intelligence checks in combat, make them worthwhile. That's the one thing that I really love about Pathfinder 2e, is that they've completely built in, doing recall knowledge checks on monsters. And they've built in bonuses too. And I think we'll talk about this maybe at the end about players, but you want players to do those things, and if you find they're not, making it so they can never know what to expect, right? Like if you see them getting kind of lax with it, throw in your monster that explodes all of a sudden, so they're like, wait a minute, I didn't know they could do that. So then they will be asking, they will be engaged, they will want to find those things out.
Absolutely, and it's interesting to note that D&D 1 has absolutely ripped that off. The old recall within combat checks is certainly becoming a big part of the new playtest for Dungeons and Dragons. One last point that I make in terms of the ways I shake up existing monsters is I'll often play around with the RP, the role-playing element of them a little bit. So instead of the dull lumbering troll, make a fast, erudite, with a high vocabulary conversationalist troll. I'll often muck around with just the way that creatures speak and the way that creatures move and their tactical nous as well. So often just having a bit of a think about what is a more intelligent zombie look like will change things dramatically, or what is a less intelligent wizard look like, or so and so. Just mucking around with that mental and social abilities of a creature can also change the way that an encounter looks very much. So these are quick ways of shaking up existing monsters. Any other points you'd like to make, gentlemen? Is that
about creating monsters, or are we going to talk more about that, or
creating, reskinning? Putting monsters together.
Another tip I would say for creating monsters and to keep it diverse, especially with your base versions, you can often give them different gear. Like if you're just making one stat block, you can give them different gear. Like say you give them a sword and a bow, right? And I think you see this a lot, and that's just the basic example. And then when you actually bring them to the table, if you're on VTT or whatever, especially easier if you're on a VTT, you can have your archers and your melee ones, and you don't have to make separate ones. You know what I'm saying? And you can give them nets, but only one or two of them actually use the nets. So I think it's an easy thing, especially for the base ones, to give them maybe a bunch of stuff, but you don't always have to use them all. And that's just an easy way to, again, get some more diversity out of your creatures without actually making all these separate sheets and tracking all these separate sheets. And again, like we said, subverting expectations. I mean, you can take something like a Yeti, right? We all know what a Yeti is, and people are starting to use those in games, but it's a myth that's maybe not as well represented. But then you say, okay, I'm going to put a Yeti in a desert.
Yes.
What does that look like? So it has maybe no hair, or has long black hair or something. And then you're like, well, what's something? Let me put a little twist on this. Sand, and then you could think maybe it has, maybe it throws up quicksand on people, just to like really kind of change. Like, and that was just a quick, I just thought of a Yeti in a desert, and I already got this like weird ability that came out of that. So again, really, taking a monster that's somewhere and putting it somewhere else that it's not normally, like that's in our mythos, is another good way to like start coming up with unique ideas. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's my final thoughts on that.
Absolutely. The other thing I look at, and if we take I guess the second part, rather than looking at an ecology, but looking at what an encounter requires as well, grabbing those big abilities that you may only need to fire off once or twice in a combat just to get that impact of what you need. A creature that can create a whirlwind that will do something dramatic within the combat landscape or things like that. If you start from those points and build in those heavily into the encounter, is something I look at as well. Carl, any last points on creating monsters and creating quick reskins or quick tips before we move on to epic bosses?
I feel like we nailed that pretty well. Honestly, I don't know if I can add any more awesomeness than it was already there. So
awesome. Well, we can add awesomeness, and that is our epic boss battle. I think it would be remiss of us to talk through compelling monsters if we didn't look at boss encounters, which really are some of the most memorable sessions I think you will ever have in role-playing games. Is those final bosses or those mini bosses that you end up putting there within a role-playing session. It might be the culmination of 3 months, 6 months, a year, many years of a campaign where you finally meet the great big bad of your session, and making those things compelling. And I actually find the challenge is making those things last long enough before the players kill them. But it's about, how do you create those epic final encounters? And this is probably a whole episode on its own, but we're going to try and give you some quick hints about how you might create some epic, compelling big bosses. Who'd like to start with this one?
Well, James, why don't you start with this one? I mean, this is a very passionate subject for you, so...
Yeah,
Sure.
lead the way.
I'll introduce myself. All right, James, what do you think? Well, actually, James, I think that and look, it is a huge part of role-playing games, and I'm very passionate about it. I think longer and harder about big boss fights than I do about any other encounter, because often my big boss fights will take almost a whole session. I run small 2-hour sessions for a lot of my games, so often boss fights take multiple sessions where we pick up in the middle of a session and move on and complete it. And I look at a multi-staged approach to these things where I actually have 3 quite specific stages of when I put together a boss fight. And a lot of it's involved around allowing the role-playing element to happen during the encounter. I think it's really important that bosses get a chance to monologue and get a chance to role-play while the fight is in play. Because if all we're doing is rolling dice and we lose the RP element of this in the most epic of sessions, then I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. So I try and structure these boss fights with phases that allow me to interrupt the fight with good roleplay as we go along. I'll briefly go through my 3 stages, and then perhaps we can have a bit of a chat about how you might start it. But my 3 stages go something a little bit like this. My first stage is about feeling out the players and feeling out the boss and setting up the terrain, setting up the environment where we will be fighting. Often players will want to just throw the biggest, toughest thing that they want heavily into the fight to try and do the most damage they possibly can. So when I'm building a boss fight, I want to make sure that my boss can survive those opening salvos of very powerful magics while I set up what will be the environment for the game and for this fight. We ran a hag battle a couple of years ago, Eric, when really all the hag did was, for the first few rounds of combat, was slowly flood this cavern with water so that I could then use some water abilities later in the fight. And in order for her to survive it, I had her cocooned in this kind of dome of bracken that the group had to battle their way and destroy before they could even get to her, which allowed me to set up the terrain and by buying myself enough time that the players could still do damage and could still do what they needed to do. And that's my step one, setting up the actual fighting space, whether you've got to flood something, whether the volcano goes off, whether there's quicksand, whether there's wind that picks up, whatever you need to do so that the terrain and the space of where the boss fight happens is epic, and it's different, because then you can use that terrain as part of what you need to do. Stage 2 for me is what I call the curve. Well, I'll add additional minions or monsters that come to aid the boss, so that there has to be a split of resources between the players. Or there's additional attacks that come from somewhere, whether the flood suddenly has water spouts that will mean that you're not just doing one turn for the boss, you're doing multiple turns so that different things are happening on the battlefield. And then stage 3 is what I call the frenzy, where for a reason or another, there is a time-sensitive element to the fight. And often that's the player's hit points, but where people feel the urgency of having to quickly resolve this, and often they'll have to come up with that decision not to deal with the other creatures because we want to kill the boss quickly, or we have to quickly escape from this room before the whole room floods, so we've got to kill the boss quickly, so that you don't ever end up in that situation where it's just slogging out a fight round after round after round. There needs to be some kind of level of urgency to it. So they're my 3 steps of when I create a boss fight: a setup, a curve, and a frenzy, which is just names I've plucked out of my hat. But that's kind of the thinking that I do whenever I create a boss fight. Guys, any similar steps or any thoughts when you're first putting a fight together in your mind for these legendary, epic last battles?
Well, the first thing is that's brilliant. I just want to say I love that. I love what you've got there. I'll add some things that are probably more tactical in nature, in the sense of it goes back to have layered encounters, have layers of encounters. So where it's not just your big bad guy the minute you step through the door. And I think you alluded to that a little bit with, having the minions come in that protect them. So, or you have to go through something before you can get there, and you can feel the tension is coming. Even though I have to get past this lieutenant, I know just on the other side of that door is what I want to be. The second one, I think sometimes we lose sight of, and I do myself, is the big bad guy, he's not going to expose themselves for no reason, right? In Savage Worlds, again, the game I play a lot, you can one-shot somebody pretty easily. You get the right roll, you get the right explosion, and before you know it, that counter that you was so important to set up, they're just dead in a second. And that's fine. I mean, that's exciting in and of itself that, you get excited to be able to do that. But they shouldn't expose themselves. They should put themselves in a position where they're protected. They're using all the rules. The bad guys can use all the rules. The PCs can. I think lots of times you pull your punches a little bit as a game master, and you don't use all the capability you have. Like, I don't know, in D&D, under that counter spell thing that everybody loves to bag on, but anyway.
Yeah.
But in Savage Worlds, it's the same thing. It's so often you can easily forget to use cover or your defensive actions, or do tests and support roles and all those sorts of things that a bad guy can do. And then the final thing I'll throw out there is this is their home, so there should be choke points. There should be ways of separating the party so that they can't come in full strength. You can leverage traps that only you know how to get past, or your minions know how to get past, or they're set up. And not traps in a dungeon sense where they just kind of are there, but they're there for a very intentional purpose to put the players in a situation where the bad guy can do some heavy damage. It's not just purely a way of slowing the players down. It's a tactical advantage. But that's just some things right off the top of my head. Again, much more tactically, as opposed to sort of the overall kind of metaphysical way that you talked about pulling together a big bad fight. So those are some of the ideas that right off the top of my head I think are kind of important when you're building out that combat situation.
Yeah, I completely agree with you guys. Like, I couldn't agree more. As far as creating interesting boss battles, especially utilizing the environment, is so big. Utilizing minions or some type of other obstacles. But I do want to bring this back a little bit to as far as designing monsters go and actually designing a boss, right? And I think an important thing about having your designed boss and to be interesting, a lot of that is build up, which I think we've talked about. But build up as far as either if you have created a family of monsters, right? You have those people fighting those monsters through the narrative, and so they have an idea for the theme. But then again, when you actually reveal the monster, you want it to be bigger and weirder than what they've seen so far. So like in ours, just go back to the rat example, right? Like I had, it was a one shot, so I had to condense everything. But going with like an interesting, I was like, okay, rats don't usually have tentacles. But I was like, but they have tails, and then so if there was a bunch of them combined, it could turn into a tentacle. So again, you could kind of combine the traits of monsters you've been building and make something unique, and that's a really good way. But again, it's the build up. So you want to have people build up to that. And if it's not something that has the family of monsters, you still build up whatever their theme is. You still build it up as far as like environmental things, or if there's some type of vegetable fungus related monster, then you have like spore creatures or whatever that you're fighting before. So they're not actually mushroom creatures, but they're somehow related, or you have evidence of whatever they are has gone through, like things that have been kind of acidically digested externally or whatever. So create your boss monster and then take things from that you can plug into the lead up, I think is a really good way to get people excited for whatever unique thing that you've created. And then, going back into the boss battle, I absolutely agree with your stages. Those things are definitely try to do. And I think they call them legendary actions and lair actions, especially lair actions in D&D.
Oh, yeah.
Is super good to use. Like always want the environment to be the other character if you're fighting a boss in its lair. And also having things that might... like in that same battle, just go back to that rat battle, Carl had jumped on this right away, and I didn't want it to be too obtuse, so I kind of was being pretty overt about it. But the rat was regenerating from having access to rats coming in through a tunnel. So he hacked the computers and closed the tunnel off to stop it regenerating. And it was more armored because of it was sitting in water. And it was like absorbing water and using that as like a shield almost. And so he shut down the water from that. So I really had like some of the abilities of this unique monster were tied to the environment. And when you interacted with the abilities, almost like a puzzle. And again, the characters had to be smart. They didn't just go and attack. So that's another way of utilizing the unique abilities, but having way to like shut off those abilities based on the environment is another really good way to kind of utilize the unique monster things.
I want to do a quick little name drop on, if I can, at this point. There's a fantastic source book that I use when I'm putting together my monster lairs. And there's a writer, he's a French guy that thinks a lot about monster design, named Trekiros. Trekiros. He's put out a fantastic book for Dungeons and Dragons, but honestly, I think you could use it for any system, called Home Field Advantage, which talks entirely about monsters using lairs and how lairs can be customized to different monsters. And he's actually taken the whole of the monster manual and then created the home bases for all of these monsters, which include lair actions, so that the actual place responds to the fight. So I'll often skim that book for ideas before I'm putting together a boss fight as well. So very important for when you're putting those little landscapes in. Guys, I've got a specific question I'd like to talk through, and that is about action economy. Action economy is a really tricky one when you're putting together a boss encounter. And I know we're talking about compelling monsters, but half the challenge I find is the survivability of these bosses. If you've got a group of 5 or 6 players, all of which are having their turns that are generally optimized, because people in boss fights hold their best spells and their best abilities, and they'll often unleash them all at the same time. How do you work through survivability of your bad guy so that there's enough time for you to do what you need to do in terms of these encounters?
Well, I mean, I think you brought it up already pretty well. I mean, utilizing the environment is the first thing. And I mean, just having physical space between the monster, like they enter the map, right? But the monster's at the other end of this chasm, and there's things but they have to get through maybe to get to the monster. Also, like you said, utilizing minions. I mean, that's I think that's the biggest trap, because I think we're more talking about 5e here. Not everything has the same action economy issue that like D&D and Pathfinder does, but utilizing minions is huge. And a really good thing that you had brought up too is about having minions in reserve is a really good way that if the players are doing too well, Like, so you might not even think you need to bring them in, but if the players are doing too well, that's when you have already written, how do these other things come in? So that's kind of like your backup. That's your safety net, is having other players. And then the third thing I would say is what I was kind of talking about before, is have the monster have almost not quite invulnerability, but have extremely powerful abilities that almost can't be overcome unless the characters, the players, have a time to stop and think, okay, what's in the environment that can actually deactivate it? So almost like in Star Wars, the shield on Hoth or whatever. But like I said, for my like rat tyrant, it was, I didn't want you guys to kill him too quickly, so I had this regeneration, I had this extra armor that you actually had to like do something, and then while that was happening, you were fighting the minions. So I think having things that switch off that are protecting it, almost like narrative armor in a way, is a really good way to do that, and is fine, and it makes a more exciting encounter anyways. So those are the couple things I would say.
So I think I mentioned lieutenants. I think you got there. Folks who are tough in and of themselves and are not just mooks that the players can easily cut through. They will they have to pull attention because they're the immediate problem that they have to solve. That allows the kind of the bad guy to stay protected. And you can do it like Eric mentions, where the environment itself you have to defeat. Or they simply, how many times have we seen in films and movies, right, where it's like the lieutenants go attack them and then they start walking out the back door heading towards their ship. And so you have to wade through these things that have a lot more in their action economy, because there's a lot more of them, to get to the bad guy initially. He's not just standing there using his one or two abilities. And I play a lot more modern games, so I think it's probably more appropriate to modern games, because definitely a monster in a D&D could have some big, huge weapon that does a ton of damage at the same time and kind of makes up for the fact that it only has one or two attacks and a reaction and all that sort of thing.
That's the issue I think, James, is that action economy actually will kill those big, strong monsters in D&D.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And not just D&D. I find it in Call of Cthulhu as well. You've got, ultimately, if a monster's only got one or two actions, that's only one or two turns, while the others can do a lot more. Gentlemen, I'm conscious of time, and as per usual, we always like to end up with a tip about players and what players can do. And I think this one's been a particularly specific Games Master session. But as a player, how can you help with this? Because ultimately, we're doing this for the players, and if there are players listening, what are some tips that you would give to players about making monsters more compelling to themselves and particularly to the other players around them? Any last-minute tips for our players? Where can we go with this?
I don't know if it's a tip, but give the GM some slack. Don't try to have encyclopedic knowledge of every possible thing. Try to avoid metagaming. And engage. James, you talked about that first part is the monologue of the foe. Before the battles happen, they're role playing. Get all hog, jump in, role play that out. Go ahead and play with that. But just remember, it's a game. It's supposed to be fun. If you know everything there is to know, then is it really as fun as it could be? So just recognize that you don't have. Knowing everything is not winning. So, cut the GM some slack and just, you don't need to know everything anyway. So I think I'm beating that dead horse, but why not monologue and RP?
There's a t-shirt. There's a t-shirt. Knowing everything is not winning. I'm going to print it. I'm going to put it. I'm going to wear it very proudly for my 12-year-olds. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this, and a little bit also for GM advice here too, specifically for players. But I mean, for one, be curious, be curious, be immersive, and I do want to touch on metagaming, because I think this is one of the areas where metagaming is bound to happen if they're not unique monsters, right? If we're talking about a troll, I think what's okay here is to accept that it happens, but then you can still be conscious of having your character ask, or asking the GM, would my character know this? Is this a common monster that they know? And even though the player, I know it, I think it's perfectly okay for you to ask these type of questions to your GM. So be communicative with your GM and say, hey, would I know about the troll's regeneration? Oh, no, you wouldn't. Okay, can I make a check? because we're not like superhuman here as far as like shutting off parts of our brain to forget that we know about the regeneration, right? It's always there. So I think if that is the case, don't feel bad that just make sure that you do the things in game and talk to the GM and make sure you ask those questions. And for the GM, I think if you have players who are asking questions, reward them. Even if they know what a creature's abilities are and they're taking the time in combat to say, I want to do I want to do a knowledge check about this creature. And they succeed, like, you can say, oh yeah, about the regeneration or whatever, but you could also give them just like a one-time, +1 on their next attack roll or something. Like, you can give them a little kind of bonus for having this, their character having knowledge about a creature. So I think it's important to kind of reward that, because that will make the players do that more. You know what I mean? And then if you are introducing new creatures, they're not caught totally off guard because they're already asking these questions about, like, can I do that recall knowledge check? Reward them for, instead of attacking, they spent the action to do that. I think that's the kind of biggest things I would say as far as from a player's side, for sure. And also, like, you guys said, give the GM a break. Like, if they wrote a monologue, you don't always have to just like, oh, my character would immediately cut them off and throw an axe at it.
Yeah.
Like, they wrote the monologue, let them do the monologue, like, let them have the monologue. And this is especially important, I think, for if you're a player with an inexperienced GM, because you don't want to, I've seen this a bunch of times where newer GMs will get, they'll get almost like dissuaded, because players don't take any time at all to kind of like buy into what they're selling, I guess is what I would say. So, let the GMs have their little fun. Let them do their monologue, and then you can come back at it, like Carl said. So, those are the only kind of tips I would say.
Yeah, nothing better than player role-playing with your big bad, knowing that this is the last time you're going to play your big bad. Yeah. It's like, hopefully, ultimately one of you are dying. So, and generally it's preferable if the NPC does. So knowing that they're buying into that's really, really important. I guess one last little tip, and this is not for players because I don't play very often, and I didn't think about this, perhaps I should have, is it's about telegraphing the big bads or the monster's abilities as well. And I was just thinking about this when you were talking about players that would ask questions. If you preempt what a monster might be doing, as in the creature inhales and the wind brushes towards it and it rises up, and you can get that faint smell of sulfur within the nose that might then prompt questions from the player that then allows them to understand what's about to happen, so that it's not entirely a surprise in terms of when you're creating new monsters out of nowhere. I think that's important. And in fact, that happened a lot with the rat encounters, where Carl was asking these pointed questions and then you're describing what he might see, which effectively is telegraphing what's going to happen next, which is an important little part of the encounter. Guys, I think we have smashed this out, and we've taken quite a long time to do it too. Sorry, we're a little over time this week.
But it's worth it. But it's well worth it.
That's me. Back to you, Carl, I guess.
Well, everyone, thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully you got something out of it. Remember, drop by masteringtherepg.com. That's all one word. For our projects, contacting us, sending us email. Like I said, you can email Game Master at masteringtherepg.com if you have questions, you need some additional advice, or more importantly, you have something you need adjudicated. Please, Eric wants to answer questions and save you from fighting amongst each other. Let us do that for you. You can also see us on Twitter at masteringtherepg. So if you like what you're hearing, give us a positive review in your podcatcher of choice and all that good stuff. And once again, this is Carl with Eric and James. So say goodbye, guys.
Sayonara.
Goodbye, guys.